So this is a presentation, as many of you know, that I presented at the World Bank's core course on pensions about 2 months ago, where they had a morning symposium which was open to other people outside the bank on social pensions versus social assistance. It's quite an interesting question. And the kind of question of the question of the particular session I was on was, should older people be targeted? Social pensions for the elderly or social assistance for households. And I think the kind of language that was used here is slightly perhaps slightly funny choice, and there's the kind of definitions you could unpick here. But really, I think what it's getting at is something that a lot of us have seen through our kind of work at the country level, that when we're talking about proposals for social pensions, universal social pensions, a lot of the time we hear, well, older people aren't all poor. So why would you give a pension to older people rather than just have some kind of poverty-targeted safety net that better targets the poor? And there's actually a chapter by two of the authors, two people from the World Bank who are on this panel with me. And they put the question like this: social pensions fall within the conceptual window of social assistance. Fiscal constraints and trade-offs between wide coverage and adequate benefit will often, particularly in poor countries, imply the need for a targeted social pension. And as they put it, if a targeting system is to be devised, there is no prima facie on the face of it. There's no case for a social pension system to be run separately from general needs-based social assistance programs. So this is the question I was attempting to answer. And what I think, in trying to kind of attempt to answer this question, a useful starting point is actually to say, well, what are countries themselves doing? Are they choosing these kind of catch-all safety nets, or are they also looking at specific social pensions that specifically, if you like, target older people? And what this chart here shows is essentially the history of the introduction of social pensions, non-contributory cash transfers to older people, since the very first social pension in 1890 in Iceland. So along the horizontal axis you have the year, and along the vertical axis for reference there's the income level of the country and GDP per capita. And a few interesting trends here are, first and foremost, that really, particularly in the last 10 to 20 years, a significant number of countries have actually introduced social pensions, those ones over to the right. There are now over 100 countries with some form of social pension in the world. And another interesting observation is when you compare that to income, there's great variety between the income level at which countries introduce social pensions, from Nepal and Bangladesh, that were very much low-income countries, to countries like Mexico, Venezuela, which were upper middle income countries, when they introduced a non-contributory cash transfer specifically for older people. And just to kind of bring a few of those examples home, and particularly this decision between something that's more targeted at the poor and something specifically looking at older people, here are kind of a couple of useful examples. And one is particularly kind of trend we're seeing in Latin America. I mean, over the last decade, 5 to 10 years in particular, there's been a kind of particular explosion in a type of cash transfer called conditional cash transfers, which really fall within the kind of framework of poverty-targeted cash transfers to the poor, to poor families, the kind of safety net model. But in spite of the presence of these conditional cash transfers, many countries have decided to introduce, in addition to that, some kind of social pension for older people. So Mexico, which has one of the most famous conditional cash transfers, these poverty-targeted safety nets, began to introduce, currently is in the process of extending a new social pension, which has really extended from not very much about 5 years ago to what should reach everyone over 65 in the next year or so. Ecuador started by kind of bolting on a small social pension to its Bono de Desarrollo Humano, the Human Development Grant, which has now kind of overtaken that almost in coverage, and now covers about 60% of older people over the age of 65. And there are other examples from Paraguay and Peru. But it's not something that's limited. So in terms of Latin America, currently in South America, every single country now has a social pension, which wasn't the case 10 years ago. And as I say, this has been in addition to this kind of poverty-targeted safety net approach. Another good example is China. As we've been kind of uncovering in some of our recent research, there's a long history of the kind of catch-all social assistance in China, particularly the 5 Guarantees program, which has looked at targeting poor households. But in spite of that, since 2009 in particular, China has decided to have a massive expansion in the coverage of what is basically it's a rural social pension system, which has a non-contributory pension component for older people. So the question is, why are the countries making this choice? Why are they looking to kind of general social assistance programs that, according to this, the article that I cited, should technically be enough to deal with old age poverty and vulnerability? And why are they rejecting that and saying, no, we need something specific to target poverty and provide a minimum income in old age? And I think a way to look at this is really starting by the way that the debate is normally framed is around kind of pitting the poor against the elderly. This is generally, why would you go for the elderly rather than specifically targeting the poor? And the way I want to kind of challenge that framework is really, or challenge the logic is really kind of challenging the 2 components of that framework. Firstly, this kind of focus on the poor really is underestimating the extent of poverty and vulnerability in developing countries. And secondly, this idea that the elderly or older people, and I've used the World Bank language here, are somehow kind of divided from society and sitting on their own, underestimates the extent to which old age is a much broader societal issue. Okay, so this question of kind of going beyond the poor, just to kind of clarify, the classic logic for this kind of poverty-targeted social transfer is usually the following. The starting point is usually that resources for social protection are limited. We don't have very much. So about low-income countries, there's not very much money for social protection. And the second kind of assumption is really that there is somehow some kind of residual group within society that we can define as the poor, those who are left out. And, from this logic, what's usually proposed is that therefore we should take these limited resources and rather than spreading them, wasting them amongst a broader group of people, for example, all older people, we should target them at the poor. And I think my favourite language that I've ever seen to describe this was from a report the World Bank did in Tanzania, where they attempted, but unsuccessfully, luckily, to rubbish our proposal for a universal pension, suggesting that there should be surgical targeting of cash transfers, which I think is particularly nice. So this is the kind of... And, as a rhetorical device, talking about the poor is something that I think has kind of existed for hundreds and hundreds of years, and in itself isn't a problem. This is an example of imagery of mendicant friars giving alms to the poor. I think that was the 12th century. A little bit later, I think it was 18th century, images of the poor, of this group in society that are poor. This is, I think, people in Birmingham in the early 20th century. Some more modern visions of what we consider to be the poor. And the latest thing, one example is the new Pope Francis recently used the language to say how I would like a poor church for the poor. So as I say, as a rhetorical device, talking about the poor, makes a lot of sense. It's quite a simple way to articulate the problem. In reality, what it has the danger is that it can hide the actual huge complexity of poverty in a number of ways. And this chart attempts to show that. And basically what this kind of diagram shows is the kind of life history and the perceived well-being of an individual. This is an older lady in Uganda, and this comes from some recent research done in collaboration with ODI. And I can leave you to have a look at the presentation in detail. But I think there's some core things that come up from this. Firstly, actually the well-being of an individual changes significantly throughout their lives. They may have times when things are going well, when they have work, and then there may be shocks and stresses that happen to them throughout their lives that change their perceived well-being. This is obviously well-being is a bit broader than the kind of income poverty definition, but I think it captures the point that there's a lot of of dynamism in the kind of well-being and status of people throughout their lives. And if you actually look at this in detail, there's a number of different kind of classic risks and kind of vulnerabilities, if you want to call it that, that pop out. There's the death of breadwinners, of orphanhood, there's unemployment, there's disability, there's old age, and all of these are kind of interplaying in different ways across this person's life course, and leading to this kind of fluctuation in poverty. Now, I haven't presented it here, but if you actually look at longitudinal poverty studies, you know, the same people following over time, again, you find massive variation. This idea that there's this static group of the poor who are kind of sitting comfortably in the poorest 20% of the population is completely inaccurate. And over short periods of time, even between seasons, you find huge numbers of people moving in and out of poverty. So there's this great dynamism. And one of the implications of this dynamism is that actually, while the percentage of people who are poor at any one moment in time may be kind of finite, actually the proportion of people who over a longer period of time are vulnerable to poverty is much greater. And this is an example of some different kind of poverty rates and different in Indonesia from a report that the World Bank did there. And what the first bar shows is the proportion of people who are below the official poverty line, which is about 1.2 PPP dollars a day, which is similar to the kind of World Bank's international poverty line. And Indonesia's been, you know, spoken quite proudly, I think, of its success in the last 10 years of really reducing this level from, I think, kind of in the high 20s, maybe a decade or so ago, down to just 13% of the population living below the poverty line. But what this tends to hide is actually when you look at slightly higher poverty lines, which might capture some of those people that over time would be falling into poverty, and may have experienced some moments in poverty, or at least a period of time, actually the proportion you could call vulnerable to poverty is actually much higher. If you go just, for example, to you know, a poverty line of 1.4 PVP dollars, suddenly the poverty rate has doubled. You know, another same proportion again. And we're talking about a tiny increment in the poverty line we're looking at. But even if you look at for example, there's a $2.4 poverty line. That's the second to the right, which is only double this kind of absolute extreme poverty line we're talking about. Suddenly, you find nearly 60% of the population, 57% of the population, are below that slightly higher line. So, when looked at from a very kind of snapshot perspective, maybe 13% of the Indonesian population in poverty at any one time. But over time, and I think the World Bank put it over a 5-year period, probably about half the population of Indonesia could expect to be in poverty. So, you know, the implications of this is that this idea that we can target the poor, which the reality becomes incredibly challenging. This idea we might be able to get a snapshot of a static group, we identify them, we give them a benefit, becomes much more complicated when we have to look over time at this constantly kind of churning dynamic. You know, one way I think of describing it is rather than having kind of a camera to kind of catch the situation of people, we have to have a kind of film camera, we have to have a kind of video camera to constantly be kind of keeping up with this. And the result is, as we see in most poverty-targeted programs around the world, there are significant exclusion errors. And I think the simple way we put it is it's normal and probably pretty good practice for about half of the targeted group to miss out and not get those transfers. So 50% exclusion area. And as I say, this is driven by the complexity of poverty, but also the fact that it's totally impractical to have this kind of video camera to capture the dynamics in poverty over time. At the very best, most poverty targeting, for example, the ones done in conditional cash transfer through proxy means testing, undertakes targeting maybe every 2 years. But in some countries, for example, Ecuador, it's done every 10 years. And you can imagine over a 10-year period, there's significant changes in the poverty status of different households. I won't go into it here, but there's also higher administrative costs because you have to build this video camera rather than have more simple forms of targeting, as we know exist in social universal pensions. It can create perverse incentives because often you are saying people will get a benefit on the condition of not having certain assets, of not having certain investments, so it can create different incentives around that. But I guess what what I'd see as, in a sense, more important are the political costs of targeting. And really this question that focusing too much on one particular group of society that is defined as the poor and dividing it in that sense has the tendency to suggest that social protection is something that happens for some people and not others. And you get the sense there are the givers, the taxpayers, the ones that are contributing, the ones that are needy, the ones that are dependent. And those ones that are needy and dependent tend to be the ones who probably have much less political voice, much less influence on securing budget for the programs that benefit them best. And it's because of that as I think many of you will know, Amartya Sen put it, that benefits meant exclusively for the poor often end up being poor benefits. And the consequence really, as I've put here, and you can see this in the budgetary patterns of social protection, is social assistance that's exclusively targeted at poor households tends to be really low in terms of budgetary spend. The big cash transfer that is perhaps the most popular one that's been introduced in the last 10 or so years, the Bolsa Familia, is actually, on the scale of it, a pretty small cash transfer program. That's about 0.6% of GDP, which is pretty small fry in terms of, I mean, even the social protection spending of Brazil. And most poverty-targeted transfers are actually much smaller. And just to emphasize, this isn't something that we've kind of worked out in the last 10 years or so, while with the kind of growth in the debate around social protection. And this is a quote from a historian, Pat Thane, on some similar debates that were happening in the late 19th century around old age and poverty, in relation to a commission on the situation of the poor relief they had there, and how it was relating to older people. So again, the same question, how is social assistance working for older people? And then I think a few years earlier in the 1870s, they'd done this big reform to really improve their targeting because they saw these inefficiencies. And she put it this way: the aim was maximum mobilization of resources, this reform where they tried to improve the targeting from all sources to be targeted upon the needs of the poor as assessed scientifically, which I really liked because it almost matched perfectly this language of the surgical targeting that we saw in Tanzania. As it turned out, the extent of poverty was too great, its causes and cure too complex for such simple scientific treatment. After a decade or so, the policy was admitted a failure. So going back to this logic, I think a way to really kind of pull it apart on the basis of this is to look at the counterfactual, the kind of logic for poverty targeting. I think a first one, just to kind of emphasize, I won't go into great detail here, is while the poverty targeters, the safety netters, as you might call them, would talk about, say, resources are limited, I think we all know that it's not as simple as that. A lot of countries have invested significant amounts in social protection relative to the kind of income level of that country. And just writing off the affordability question straight away is a very simplistic way to look at it. And secondly, rather than look at this question that there's a residual group of people in the population that we can call poor, that actually poverty is widespread, poverty and vulnerability are widespread and dynamic, which means it's very hard to kind of find this particular group. And so what's the conclusion? Well, what we'd say is actually, rather than trying to kind of constantly chase this almost kind of this elusive group of people who we can define as the poor, that a better approach is a more systematic one, that rather than looking for certain people, attempts to cover certain kind of core life course risks and vulnerabilities that people face throughout their lives. And this is what's really, I think, captured in the concept of the social protection floor, which defines the key risks and vulnerabilities people face related to family, including childhood, maternity, unemployment, disability, old age, and then really says, well, how do we address those individually so that they don't lead, that those issues that people are facing don't mean that they fall into poverty. I think it's also worth emphasizing that this social protection floor approach, this systematic approach, really reflects the direction that most countries tend to go in the development of more comprehensive social protection systems. Okay, so moving on to the second question. So I've talked about trying to go beyond the poor, and the second point is really trying to go beyond the elderly, beyond this focus on this kind of distinct group that are somehow separate from the rest of society. I think a useful way to look at this is to say, well, why are countries investing in these basic pensions for this particular group of people, because the way it's often put by the people we'll discuss with, particularly in the World Bank, for example, is all this money is being spent on older people. It's such a waste of money, and as we say, not being spent on more efficient schemes. And this is a trend we do see significantly across the world, that basic pensions, social pensions, do tend, within the expansion of kind of more comprehensive social protection systems, do seem to have a certain level of kind of prioritization. Firstly, in terms of sequencing, I don't think it's inaccurate to say that as countries go extending more broad-based social protection systems, often old age and disability seem to be the starting point. And that's as much, I think, in the case in many European countries as it has been in many developing countries. And another thing is that throughout time, it tends to remain a kind of core spend of the social protection system. Again, most OECD countries, it's the biggest single spend within social transfers, and similar patterns in Brazil, in Chile, and in a whole variety of other countries. And that this has a major impact on poverty and inequality, actually, for the whole population. So why are countries doing this? Well, what some people say is, of course, it's because there's been a kind of rational choice that older people are poorer, so we should target them, and that's an effective use of resources. However, the evidence of the kind of relative poverty rates of older people versus the rest of the population, as measured by household budget surveys and standard poverty analysis, are actually in most countries not all that compelling when you look at the kind of regional, international surveys. Often they say in about kind of 60 or 70% of countries, older people are a bit poorer, but also in a few of them they're a bit less poor. There's not this real picture that suddenly we're seeing older people are much poorer than everyone else. And similarly, really at the root of this is that there are actually some real questions as to whether these poverty measures we use, and particularly how they're used in developing countries, can really tell us much about the individual situation of older people. At a fundamental level, these are surveys that are collected at a household level, and I think most of us will recognise that the situation of older people is often determined significantly by those intra-household distribution of income and resources. So alternatively, we say, well, then it's not this evidence-based, logical decision. It's because older people are voting and that they're dominating the electoral vote and they have all the power. And this is obviously something we hear a lot in more developed countries. But that also doesn't really seem to explain why a country like Lesotho, for example, decided to invest 1.5% of GDP in a social pension when only 4.3% of the population are over the age of 65. In terms of electoral politics, that doesn't quite seem to add up. Similar for Nepal, just 4% of the population over 65. I imagine it was fewer in 2005 when they actually introduced a social pension. But even Brazil spends, I think, more on its pension system than most other countries, and has a very generous pension system for in terms of the kind of social pensions. But again, only about 7% of the population over 65. In terms of the kind of demographics of the politics, it doesn't seem to make an awful lot of sense. So as a way to kind of question this, I think it's good to kind of step back and actually look at, well, what are the kind of characteristics of old age, and what's the issue in a sense that we're trying to tackle with a pension, which is perhaps slightly different from this older people might be poorer. I think one of the key characteristics we need to remember is old age is something that's universal and inevitable in that whether or not it happens, all of us expect to reach an old age. And that has important implications. The second point, which really relates to this question of the intra-household dynamics, is it touches upon issues of autonomy and dignity. So whereas, a way to bring this home is advocates of a more kind of poverty-targeted approach would say it's adequate to target a household and make sure that their household income is an adequate level above a poverty line, and therefore it's kind of job done. We've got people out of poverty. But old age is actually very much linked to individuals' position with that household, and it may be an issue if an older person is perhaps it may still be an issue if an older person is in a household where the is above the poverty line, but they don't necessarily get all of those resources, or even if they do get a certain share of resources, they don't feel that they have control or influence or autonomy in how to use that. The question of kind of individual income versus household. Now, the kind of universality and inevitability of old age means that it's not just an issue that affects older people themselves. And a key question that people ask throughout their lives, and particularly as they get closer to what they might perceive as old age, is how will I support myself? How will I support it? And we're talking purely on the kind of financial side here when I get older. And there's quite a lot of evidence that people's perception of what will happen to them as they get old does affect their life course decisions. And one, it's a very complicated issue. There's a fair bit of research, more in more OECD countries, but some in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, looking at how social protection, particularly pension systems, affect fertility decisions. So, as it's been put by an academic that we work quite closely with on the research we recently did in Mozambique, having too many children was for a long time, and still today, the main form of social protection in Mozambique and perhaps in most sub-Saharan African countries. So in the absence of any kind of pension system, any formal support system in old age, people will look to having as many children who can support them when they get old. And there's a fair bit of evidence of sub-Saharan African, southern African countries in particular that have put in place social pensions of some kind of marked reduction in fertility rates. So it's a complicated issue, but there does seem to be a link there. So, yes, the universality of old age, inevitability, means that whether people get a pension isn't just a concern for older people today, it's a concern for those people who are going to be older in the future. A second important way in which social protection pension systems affect younger generations is in the kind of the way in which the receipt of a pension by an older person will affect people of other generations. And one way to put it is in a poorer family, for example, or poor or vulnerable to poverty family, supporting an older person could be seen as actually an additional strain. It's an additional strain in terms of where am I going to spend these resources. And as the counterfactual, when a pension is in place, that strain is to some extent, you could say, reduced. And as we've seen from various different studies where older people receive pensions, that money is shared with other household members. Yeah, and as I mentioned above, finally there's this question of dignity and autonomy, which is beyond this question of whether it affects the wider society. Is it enough for people to rely on family support and rely on the fact their household will be in poverty or not? And a useful kind of piece of information to help understand this is some recent research from East Asia, which really looked at this question of people's expectations of old age and retirement. And then East Asia is, as I think many of us know, a region of the world where, from our policy engagements, I'm sure we've seen a lot that people say, well, you know, in Asia the traditions are different from elsewhere in the world. You know, Europe, North America, and the expectation is that children will look after their older parents, and that's a kind of strong cultural norm. But actually, when you look at the expectations of people, of younger people in Asia, you actually find slightly kind of more complex picture. And this is a survey done by a recent study that asked people in a number of countries, mainly slightly kind of upper middle or higher income countries, but also including China, who ideally should be mostly responsible for providing income to retired people, as they said, so people when they get older. And in all countries, I think what's very interesting is that, first of all, actually the expectation that children should support people in old age is relatively low, apart from Singapore, where 22% of people expect that children and other family members should be the main source of support. In most countries, it's 10% or below. And the majority of people either expect or hope for one thing: either they can support themselves through their own savings, or they'll be supported by government. So going back to this autonomy question, this seems to point towards, even in a region where family support is seen to play a much bigger role than perhaps in others, still people seem to want to have some of their own kind of personal income that they can call their own to depend on when they're in their own old age. And China, interestingly, is perhaps the one that's a kind of outlier in that respect. I don't think I'm going to discuss that in great detail. Okay. Yeah. So basically, to kind of conclude, I had a better way to present this than I actually did when I presented this at the World Bank. So going back to this question, should there be should older people, should there be some kind of pension system or a social pension exclusively for older people, or should we just deal with the question of poverty by just targeting the poor through some kind of social assistance system? Well, the first thing as I've gone through is that poverty and vulnerability and these issues of poverty and vulnerability that people are facing in developing countries go way beyond a kind of defined group that we can call the poor. The problem that we're trying to deal with is much bigger than one that can be narrowed down to a kind of targeted system. Therefore, there's need for a more systematic approach. And similarly, you know, the counterfactual, the question of our kind of target group of the elderly, well, actually, pensions are much more about just targeting a particular group in society. And rather looking at the impacts of old age on people as they kind of go through the life course and look towards old age, and also on people who are living and sharing their lives with older people. And particularly this intergenerational question suggests that it's not really enough to rely on this safety net approach and wait till people are older and then say, oh, well, we'll kind of give you some kind of support if we deem you to be poor. But people need to have some kind of reliable predictability that when they reach old age, they will have something to rely on that gives them a level of autonomy, a level of dignity. And that's why the challenge, I think, as we see it, is how can countries, perhaps with a mixture of approaches guarantee a kind of basic income security that people are going to be able to look forward to. And so on this basis, my suggestion is really changing the question. It's not really about social assistance targeting the poor or versus old age, because I think the sense we'd get is that increasingly countries will and do seem to move towards this kind of guarantee, some kind of guaranteed system of income security in old age. And if that's the case, then really the more important question is what's the mix? And going back to the chart where we looked at people hoping to either save for themselves and depend on their own income or depend on government, I think a real key question is that therefore how do you combine that private saving, that private provision for old age with something that's that is provided through a social protection system? And yeah, I won't go into this in great detail. We can perhaps discuss it afterwards. But what HelpAge is suggesting that a priority for developing countries, in light of high informality, high levels of poverty, and people simply not being able to contribute to a great extent to old age pensions, the priority is to put in place a basic minimum citizens pension, a non-contributory pension that covers all or most older people. And that on top of that, you can try and increase adequacy that people receive throughout their lives through different approaches to kind of contributory pensions, individual savings.